You might think that pilots are the most diligent and careful people in the world, but everybody makes mistakes from time to time. So let's fasten our seatbelts and go through the 10 worst mistakes pilots have ever made. Number 10. The Southwest pilot ranter. The only difference that separates this pilot from your average sexist homophobe is that the average guy has the common decency not to broadcast his views. Captain James Taylor was a Southwest Airlines pilot that made headlines back in 2011 for accidentally broadcasting a conversation he had after his headpiece got stuck on broadcast. In his enlightening speech, James talked about his past 6 months of unsuccessful courtship, openly discussing his views on gays, grannies, and grandes, which I can only assume is something quite insensitive. Here's a few of the highlights from his tirade.
11 out of 12. There's 12 flight attendants, individual, never the same flight attendant twice. 11 over the top homosexuals and a granny. 11. I mean, think of the odds of that. I thought I was in Chicago, which was Partyland. After that, it was just a continuous stream of gays and grannies and grandes. Well, I don't give a I hate 100% of their.
But to top it all off, he later went on to complain about his co-worker who refused to go on a date with him, and an instance where 2 chicks refused to sleep with him after an assumingly lovely night of racist rants. This little speech was broadcast over the air traffic control frequency, which means that every plane in the Houston area got to hear this motivational speech, some who even warned him during his speech.
Okay, whoever's transmitting, you better watch what you're saying.
Nonetheless, he carried on, eventually apologizing in an awkward way at the end of his rant.
Houston, SkyWest 6285, we were 19.5 for 230, and that was not us.
But, and you knew this was coming, James sent out a heartfelt apology letter, and thus he got to keep his job and presumably go on to fight against the gay agenda. Number 9. Missing the airport by a long shot. Have you ever simply trailed off and forgot what you were doing? Well, at least you weren't flying a plane at the time. Back in 2009, 2 Northwest Airlines pilots got into a heated discussion about airline policy, which seemed to be so important that they managed to forget that they were flying a damn plane and trailed off the planned course for an hour and 18 minutes. During the incident, the pilots went radio silent and all air traffic control's inquiries went unanswered, which prompted concern that the plane might have been hijacked or completely lost. Thankfully, air traffic control managed to reach a plane that was in the area, and it managed to contact the 2 pilots, which were, at that point in time, 150 miles away from their intended landing site. The whole incident had a happy ending though, as the pilots managed to get back on course and land all of the 140 passengers safely. But the pilots were suspended for such an incompetent move that could have ended in disaster. Imagine if they were discussing today's politics. They would have gotten halfway around the world before they got back to reality. Number 8. Illusions. Being a pilot is difficult because you have to stay alert at all times, but not all pilots are constantly attentive, like one pilot of Air Canada Flight 878 in 2011 who took a nap, which is permitted and often encouraged, right before the final approach. The officer woke up feeling a bit unwell and mistook the planet Venus for a nearby US Air Force plane, thinking it was heading straight for them. Disobeying the captain's orders, the confused officer plunged the airplane into a dive, which the captain barely managed to correct, just missing a nearby plane. While everyone survived, the sudden dive sent passengers flying into the roof of the aircraft, injuring 14 people. A Fly Dubai flight was not as lucky in a similar situation. In 2016, pilots of Fly Dubai Flight 981 were caught in dense clouds and started doing flybys near their intended runway in order to prevent wind shear from crushing the plane. Sadly, the clouds played with their senses in such a way that they misjudged their altitude and location, and the plane did a nosedive directly into the runway, which was filmed by nearby cameras. Just goes to show how difficult a pilot's job is. Number 7. Definitely high. A Lion Air pilot was arrested back in 2012 after he was caught flying a plane under the influence of methamphetamine. Props to him for not drinking and flying, but you'd imagine that this isn't in compliance with a rule or two. The pilot was due to fly to Makassar, but was caught just hours before the flight because a random drug test actually caught his nasty habit before it caused others harm. Oddly enough, the pilot didn't get his license revoked, but was rather sent to rehab and will be fit to fly once more after he gets out. Number 6. Playtime in the sky. Giving your kid the wheel in a car is cute and all, but not if said car has 75 passengers, is traveling at hundreds of kilometers an hour, and is kilometers above the ground. But that hasn't stopped some. In 1994, Aeroflot Flight 593 had a normal flight until relief pilot Kudrinsky brought his 2 children in the cockpit while he was on duty. As a charming little gesture, the captain allowed his children to sit in the co-pilot seat, but sadly he didn't completely notice what they were doing. Shortly after, the plane started to bank to one side and slowly lose control as extreme G-forces were applied to the cockpit's occupants, who had no ability to regain control of the plane. Sadly, as much as the pilots tried, the aircraft crashed on a remote hillside and all of the passengers lost their lives. To rub salt into the wound, the nature of the incident wasn't revealed for a long time, as the airline company denied all claims of children being inside the cockpit. Number 5. Averting complete disaster. You'd assume they'd teach airline pilots the difference between a runway and a taxiway, but it seems that Air Canada had other priorities. The unnamed pilot of Air Canada Flight AC-759 made headlines in 2017 when he was preparing for the final approach to San Francisco International Airport, despite 4 giant planes being on the runway below him. The pilot allegedly got confused as he flew above the taxiway and saw some lights below him, even though air traffic control repeatedly told him that he was clear to land. Turns out, air traffic control was right about the landing. It was just a few hundred meters away from the location the pilot was aiming for. Luckily, a brave soul at air traffic control noticed the mistake while the pilot was a mere 50 meters above the planes and immediately ordered him to turn around for another go at the landing. Had that person not given the order to turn around, this would have definitely been the greatest aviation disaster in history. Number 4. Texting and flying. If you think texting and driving is bad, imagine texting while focusing on all these controls. In 2012, the pilot of a Jetstar Airways flight was preoccupied with his mobile phone and managed to forget one of the most crucial parts of landing a plane: lowering the landing gear. While some 400 feet above the ground, the pilot and co-pilot snapped back to reality as the alert went off to warn them, but it was too late as the landing gear didn't have time to fully deploy. Luckily, the pilot managed to pull up and get the plane under control in order to try again for another landing. Number 3. Flying under the influence. The thought of having a drunk pilot is terrifying, but for one pilot, it's the norm. In February of this year, David Hans Arnsten pleaded guilty to flying commercial planes under the influence during his career as a pilot. That's almost 20 years of drunk flying. Perhaps at that point you'd be more scared for him to fly sober. Then again, since co-pilots exist, the thought of a single drunk pilot isn't too scary. He was caught in 2014 after a random drug and alcohol check, and he had a blood alcohol level of 0.142, which is 3 times the legal piloting limit of 0.04. While being over the legal limit isn't technically drunk, this could have ended really badly. David Hans is now facing 1 year in prison for his gross misconduct. Number 2. Tenerife Airport Disaster. While the previous entries probably made you laugh, this one is a bit depressing. In 1977, 2 Boeing 747 passenger jets collided on the runway of now Tenerife North Airport, which led to the deaths of 583 people. During the time of the disaster, there was a terrorist incident at Gran Canaria Airport, which caused a lot of flights to go to Tenerife and thus caused huge traffic problems. There, 2 Boeing 747 passenger jets collided on the runway: KLM Flight 4805 and Pan Am Flight 1736. After an investigation by Spanish authorities, the root cause was discovered. The pilot of the KLM flight made a mistake and thought that he had clearance from air traffic control to proceed with takeoff, but he didn't. The runway was shrouded in fog and the plane hit the other one, which was still on the runway, but about to turn off onto the taxiway. While KLM tried to protect their pilot, naturally, in the end they accepted the blame and reimbursed the victims' families. But this simple pilot mistake marked a huge turning point in aviation history, influencing lots of improvements in air traffic control and pilot communication. Before I reveal number 1, have a look at some other pilots that would have clearly done better with a comedy career. First, here's a pilot that obviously wouldn't mind if anxious people started jumping out of the plane in a frantic craze. But if that didn't get a chuckle out of you, have a look at a man that could have set the record for most heart attacks caused by one person. Number 1. Once in a lifetime selfie. In May of 2014, a Cessna 150K plane crashed, killing 2 people. After a while, a report revealed that a GoPro camera was found amongst the wreckage, and further investigations discovered that both the pilot, Amritpal Singh, and his passenger were preoccupied with taking selfies. The report did conclude that selfie taking was the reason for the crash, especially because their flash was on, which heavily impacts pilot performance. Of course, these selfies were all inside the cabin. You may have seen this picture of a pilot taking a selfie out of the window, but this is impossible. If you wonder what would happen in this scenario, take the story of Captain Tim Lancaster back in 1990. A wrongfully installed window of a British Airways flight caused Captain Tim to be pulled halfway from a decompressed cockpit while 17,000 feet above the ground. Luckily though, his co-pilot managed to grab him by his legs and prevent him from flying away. They made an emergency descent to reach an altitude with sufficient air pressure and then made an emergency landing. Despite just holding on to him, the co-pilot got frostbite on his face and fingers, while Tim Lancaster endured 22 minutes of freezing wind chill. He survived with frostbite, bruising, shock, and fractures to his right arm, left thumb, and right wrist. The professionalism of his team is a testament to just how well trained and skilled most pilots are. Despite these mistakes, most pilots are first class. Have you ever experienced anything frightening in the sky? Let me know in the comment section down below, and thanks for watching.